The 2023 Cattle Industry Convention and NCBA trade show is underway here in New Orleans, Louisiana, and cattlemen and women from across the nation are gathered here to work on the important issues impacting the industry and also taking in the impressive NCBA trade show. I would like to mention that our friends at Neogen and their product Identity Beef is helping bring you this coverage on our social media pages, radio and TV throughout this week's coverage. And every single year, we have the opportunity to sit down with the leaders of the cattle industry. And joining us here today is Mr. Don Schiefelbein from Minnesota. And Don, you will be passing that gavel to our friend Todd from South Dakota here at the end of the convention. But what's it like to come here and look back on the past year as president and also the previous year sitting on the executive board? What's that really like as we look at 2023?
Well, things look good, and I probably won't be shedding a tear, but things look really good, and I can tell you what, we made incredible progress as an industry. And sometimes, you know, those tough times, those COVID times, almost bond you together stronger, because you have to deal with some really tough issues, some really tough markets. And I tell you what, I couldn't be more proud of our industry on the way we've handled a couple of these issues, come together and said, here's a solution that's workable for everybody.
And Donnie, obviously there's been a lot of challenges. Who would have thought that 2020, everything that came with the pandemic, the shutdowns, how are you feeling as we're in a post-pandemic world about just the demand for beef and some of those challenges producers are facing? What's your feeling about that?
Well, I couldn't be more optimistic about the future. You know, if you look at where we've come through, the largest single disruption to our beef industry in its history, and to see where calf prices are today and look at what CattleFax and others are projecting what cattle prices will be next year and the year after, boy, I think we're on sound footing, and I feel very good about where this industry goes the next couple of years.
You know, you traveled all over the U.S. In particular, you've spent a lot of time out in the western United States. And what's that like, understanding the different challenges that producers in the Southeast versus the Northwest, the Northeast? What is that like, just sitting down and listening to producers and the issues that they go through?
Well, until you're president of NCBA, you don't realize how big a ship this whole cattle industry is, and everybody has different interests and desires and what works in their part of the country and what works in others. And of course, as you know, this whole drought has had a huge impact on breeders across the land, and I hope it looks like this moisture's coming back and more common sense moisture will come to the whole industry. So I feel pretty good that we're on a pretty good footing for the rest of the industry for the next few years anyway.
Now, of course, input costs are on the tops of producers' mind, whether that's fuel, fertilizer, the cost of hay. What are some of the issues that NCBA worked on that front to have producers' voice heard out in Washington, D.C.?
Well, transportation, right? And transportation is key to making sure things go from one place to the other and keeps costs under control. And we wanted to make sure, boy, shipping was unparalleled, can continue to flow. And as you know, there were lots of opportunities for us to disrupt the entire transportation system. I think the way we kept things going, the way we kept the whole supply chain kind of going in sync, that was a common theme for the administration, is don't disrupt the supply chain, including transportation.
Now, again, we've talked about a lot about the pros and cons in the industry right now, because there is a lot weighing on producers' minds. But as we look ahead to 2023, what's a message that you have for cattle producers back home about just the role that NCBA is playing and being an advocate for them, whether they're a member or not?
Well, one doesn't have to look very far and see things like waters of the United States and see how these issues continue to raise their ugly heads again and again. And boy, if we didn't have a face of NCBA in Washington, D.C., who would have our backs, right? And so it's so important that as these issues come up and they continue, our enemies are very, very focused on trying to put us out of business. It's so important that we have somebody who takes the message back to the congressman and has your and my backs in Washington, D.C.
Well, again, Donnie Schiefelbein is wrapping up his year as president during this year's event. Say hello to the family. I know they're probably all down here, and we're going to have more conversations with cattle producers throughout this week, talking about the important information impacting the nation's livestock industry.
You're working to preserve the ground for the next generation. Shouldn't your cow herd be built for the future too? Igenity Beef provides DNA testing for 17 critical traits on a 1 through 10 scale, along with indexes and parentage. This tool aids in selection and management of commercial females and provides marketing opportunities to build your herd for the next generation. Use code RADIO to get 20% off your next Igenity Beef order. Learn more about Igenity. Go to neogen.com or call 877-443-6489.
Well, the Cattle Industry Convention and NCBA trade show is still the premier event for anyone involved with the cattle business. And this week here in New Orleans at CattleCon 23, I had the opportunity to visit with the American National Cattlewomen's president, Reba Mazak out of Florida, and the Montana Cattlewomen's president, Suze Bohleen. It's fun to be joined today by Reba Mazak, the president of the American National Cattlewomen from Florida. And what a celebration, Reba, this year here in New Orleans for cattlewomen near and far, because among so many other things, you ladies are celebrating your 70th anniversary this year. How exciting is that?
It's been awesome. We have had steak and cake at every event we've been at, but just to celebrate all of the great ladies that worked so hard ahead of us. It has been great to study their history, to see how far we've come, and also see how we've changed, but still an organization.
Well, as many of us know that grew up in the beef cattle industry, the American National Cattlewomen, for a lot of us on the local level, was always known as the Cowbells. But you ladies have transitioned your wonderful organization into so much more than what it was originally founded on. But still, a lot of those original principles remain.
They do. We still stand on those 3 pillars that we were organized on, and that is beef education, promotion and development, and legislative. But now we go to Washington, D.C., and we represent some cattle producers because we are cattle producers ourselves, so many of us. And with social media and the changing of times, we've learned to accommodate people through that as well. We just have been able to stay in our organization and do well because we're used to changing with what happens.
Reba, talk about the importance of ladies who are involved with the beef cattle industry to get involved within an organization, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or here at the national level when it comes to cattlewomen activities.
It's so important for the ladies to have some support and to realize that they're not in that alone. Whether it's feeding cattle in the wintertime when it's really cold or snowing, or trying to find cattle when there's been a hurricane. You know, I think we're all part of the team and always have been. Ladies are starting to be recognized for that place that they play. And we've always stood by our families, our men, our brothers, our sisters, our husbands, and our dads, and help make things happen. And there's just a few more opportunities for ladies to move into those leadership roles. And American National Cattlewomen give them the opportunity for that. We've got a lot of great committees that work locally in the schools, as well on the national level, go into Washington, D.C., as I said. So there's so many opportunities to build your profile and build your resume up through American National Cattlewomen.
You know, talk about some of the high policy priorities that you ladies have been talking about already here in New Orleans at some of your meetings.
Yes, this morning we had our board of directors meeting, and we went through the new policies that are going to be coming forth through NCBA this week. And we took a vote on them. We had a lot of discussion on them. We've got ladies that are impacted by the wolf project that's happening out west. And when we went to Washington, D.C. this year, we talked about our border security. We talked about WOTUS, you know, waters of the United States is so important, and a lot of the government overreach for the public lands.
What about Wired? That's a big and important program within the Cattlewomen organization, whether at the state or national level. Tell us about Wired.
Yeah, well, Wired stands for Women in Ranching Education Development, and it is a hands-on 2.5-day program that we offer to our ladies on the national level. We get them BQA certified. We get them in the chutes, handling cattle, learning from a veterinarian about the proper place for shots and things like that. But also go into a closed room situation and talk about EPDs and how to pick bulls out, and then how to plan your legacy on passing it down to your children. You know, there's so many hats that we all wear, especially as a woman in a family. So we just really trying to educate them within a bunch of ladies where they're very comfortable. There's no wrong question to ask, and there's no criticism in that.
So if there's a lady out there watching us that wants to become more involved with the Cattlewomen organization at any level, but more specifically on the national level, I mean, where do they go for more information to even start the conversation of getting more involved?
Well, we have a great website. It's ancw.org. And there is lots of information there, and they can just even ask us, just say what town and state that you live in, and we can hook you up with your local organization, your state president that we'll have on file as well. So just reaching out to us, and we can hook you up with the people locally to you.
Well, that sounds great, and we appreciate the opportunity to visit with you here in the Crescent City, Reba, and thank you for your past year's service to the American National Cattlewomen Organization and for all the years of your service in the beef cattle industry. Again, Reba Mazak out of the great state of Florida,
That's right.
the current president of the American National Cattlewomen. You know, Reba just mentioned those state presidents and how they can play a very important role back at home. We're going to talk with the president of the Montana Cattlewomen, Suze Bohleen, right after this. Well, as promised, our next guest is Suze Bohleen, the president of the Montana Cattlewomen out of Wilsall. And Suze, we've been having some great discussions already as we kick things off here in New Orleans at the CattleCon 23, the Cattle Industry Convention and NCBA trade show underway all week long. But for folks out there who are tuning in and catching this particular segment, the American National Cattlewomen kind of kicked off CattleCon 23, as they always do every year. You know, why is it important for cattlewomen like yourself from Montana and across this great country of ours to have such a strong presence at this particular convention?
Well, I think it's because in this day and age, the women are an integral part of the ranch. They're not just the wife. They are out getting dirty every day, a lot of them. But a lot of them have a job in town. They might teach to help support the family. But they're engaged. And I think that's what's really important. These women that came to the convention are all engaged and active in their county, in their state, and then in the ANCW.
Well, you and I have been talking a lot recently about just the rich heritage in these ranching and farming communities, and yours back home is no different. And just what comes out of having a lifestyle and a career as a farmer or rancher or cattle buyer? I mean, how did you get really, excited about, taking the next step from just becoming like a local leader to throwing your hat in the ring and now getting the opportunity to serve on the state level as the Montana Cattlewomen president?
Well, in California growing up, and then after my dad retired from teaching and my folks moved to the ranch with my grandparents. My mom was very active in the Cattlewomen in Humboldt County, and so she kind of set the tone, and she took my grandma some. But when Calvin and I moved to Montana after finishing college and making a little journey through Minnesota and South Dakota, his mother was very active in the Cattlewomen, and so they took me to meetings and they got me started. And as a educator, I found that the beef ed was my niche.
Well, let's talk about that, because I mean, educating people at all different age levels is certainly important, but I mean, when it comes to like educating our young people out there, our students, I mean, that is a passion of yours, and that's certainly a passion of the Cattlewomen organization, both at the state level, local level, and here at the national level. I mean, talk about the importance of getting beef's important message to those students out there.
Well, I think that it's important to start with the elementary kids, and about how we treat animals, how we're kind, keep them healthy, we give them vaccinations so they won't get sick, and then how we handle cattle, how we treat them humanely and carefully, because if you poke one of them, they'll poke you back. But
That is very true.
yes, we've all experienced that, haven't we? But and then when you got to the junior high and the high school age kids, of how to purchase beef, how to be a consumer, how to cook with it and have a pleasing end result. And so when kids go out to eat, they still talk about beef, it's what's for dinner and stuff. So, I think we're having a good message, and we're talking about how nutritious it is and how important to your brain development, your health. And so we just keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, back home in Big Sky Country, I mean, in addition to what you just said, I mean, what are some of the other projects that the Montana Cattlewomen, more specifically, is going to be working on here in 2023?
We will continue doing some of the farm fairs. Gallatin County has a huge one in the spring, and with the Nile, we do the Ag Days for the fourth graders. We also provide beef for the family consumer science teachers. It's something that kind of went by the wayside, but we're able to do that again. We are your beef checkoff dollars at work, because we provide beef for the classroom to cook for the family consumer science. We also provide recipes, beef charts, all the information to become a good consumer.
Yeah, we were talking about the education, about reaching, those young people with, what we're doing in the beef cattle industry. But you just mentioned like those beef charts and the recipes. Those are more geared towards older people, right? I mean, obviously. How important are those type of informational pieces, like something as simple as a recipe card for any particular beef dish, so that when somebody makes that conscious choice to purchase beef at their meat case, they go home and have a rewarding and delicious beef eating experience?
Well, I think we have gotten away from cooking from scratch in a lot of cases, but there are some really good products available. If you're not into the cooking from scratch, there's some really good dishes that are prepared, maybe frozen, maybe fairly fresh, and you can take them home and cook them very easily, a lot cheaper than some of the restaurants. But in a lot of cases, both the parents work, and so the kids are home, and they can help. And so starting them young doesn't hurt.
No, absolutely. Let's just bring this thing full circle. Let's bring it back here to New Orleans this week. How important is it for ladies like yourself, whether it's you from Montana or someone from New York or like Reba from Florida, for all you ladies to come together at a convention like this one, and if nothing else, just have that opportunity to network, visit, share ideas?
Well, there's no point in remaking the wheel. And so we find ideas from other states, and whether it's over lunch, dinner, or a cocktail, or it's in a meeting at a presentation by somebody, you learn a new fact, a new idea to take to a classroom, or a new idea to take a fair booth, because some states can't get in the classrooms like we can. And so, it's just the exchange of ideas is so important.
Absolutely. And we'll end it with that. Suze, thank you for joining us.
Okay.
All right, we've been talking with Suze Bohleen, the president of the Montana Cattlewomen, just one of the many thousands and thousands of cattlemen and cattlewomen that are joining us here in New Orleans, where the cattle industry has actually transformed New Orleans into Moo Orleans. attendance this week for this year's Cattle Industry Convention and NCBA Trade Show. Lane Nordland and I, along with Paul Humphrey, we're just excited to be joining these cattle industry leaders down here this week. And of course, we're going to have a lot more coverage from America's Crescent City on our radio and our television programs, as well as our social media channels here on the Western Egg Network. By the way, our coverage this week is being sponsored by our friends at Neogen. Be sure to check them out and their Identity Beef genetic tools, all designed to help improve your bottom line. And that's really what it's all about. You can get more details online by visiting neogen.com.
You're working to preserve the ground for the next generation. Shouldn't your cow herd be built for the future too? Identity Beef provides DNA testing for 17 critical traits on a 1 through 10 scale, along with indexes and parentage. This tool aids in selection and management of commercial females and provides marketing opportunities to build your herd for the next generation. Use code RADIO to get 20% off your next Identity Beef order. Learn more about Identity. Go to neogen.com or call 877-443-6489.
Returning back with more of our conversations here on the road from the Cattle Industry Convention and NCBA Trade Show. Again, coverage being brought to you by our friends at Neogen here this week. And again, Washington, D.C., it's called the Swamp, but there's a voice for cattle producers out there with the D.C. office, of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And each day, boots are on the ground advocating on the important issues impacting the livestock industry. And joining us here today is the Vice President of Government Affairs out in the D.C. office, Ethan Lane. And Ethan, we're here at convention. This is truly where the policy book that you follow, that the members set, is going to get voted on this week. But you've been pretty busy pre-convention, and there's a lot of lawsuits going on that NCBA has filed on behalf of cattle producers, whether that be Waters of the U.S. coming back to life, or the lesser prairie chicken and the listings that have come forth in the last few months. Maybe talk about that legal aspect that NCBA provides its members in fighting on the issues that are important to them.
Well, we always forget that there are actually three different parts of government, right? I mean, you have the executive branch, you have the legislative branch, and then you have the judicial branch. And when all of your other options have been exhausted, both on Capitol Hill and with the federal agencies, the courts tend to be sort of the last bastion, right? And that's what we're doing here. The WOTUS issue is one that is so familiar to so many cattle producers because it's been haunting us for so long. This is the latest front in that war. Filing a lawsuit, leading a group of 17 different groups that all view this issue the same way, and really kind of hammering down on this agency's just refusal to really hear input from cattle producers on what would take a rule from this sort of incendiary place that it's been and move it back towards somewhere where some predictability and accountability for producers is in the mix. And right now, that's just not a part of this rule. So we are taking it to federal court. Obviously, that's happening at the same time as the Supreme Court's already reviewing a decision, potential decision on the previous WOTUS rule. And what they come up with there as far as that significant nexus standard could have implications for the case we're involved in now. But before that even gets to that point, our first goal with these lawsuits is to try to stop this rule from moving forward, which would inject even more uncertainty into this process.
Now, also the lesser prairie chicken, parts of Western Ag Network country definitely impacted by these listings, and technically there's two different listing areas. Can you walk us through that and then what that legal process is looking like?
So the lesser prairie chicken range goes from all the way down in West Texas and New Mexico all the way up into Kansas, and you see very different population concentrations in those areas. There's a lot of prairie chickens up in Kansas. They hunt them up there. They have in the past. Down into Texas, there's a sparser population, spread out a little more. And in the past, these listings have been one species because they are one species. This listing really kind of set a new standard for poor Endangered Species Act listings. It split the population into two what they call distinct population segments. They listed one segment as endangered, which is the worst possible listing. And then the northern tier, where there are more birds, is listed as threatened, but without a lot of protections for agriculture in there. And it creates a system where these third-party unnamed overseers kind of get to sit in judgment of your grazing plan. It's a problematic rule for a variety of reasons. We've joined with oil and gas interests, our state affiliates and others to push back on that rule in federal court. The last time Fish and Wildlife tried to list this species, it was overturned and vacated in federal court, and it was such a commanding decision that the Fish and Wildlife Service didn't even appeal it. So we're going to continue to try to make that case that this is just an inappropriate use of the Endangered Species Act.
Now, a lot of producers in the countryside just recently heard in our coverage about the animal disease traceability proposed rule changes. USDA says this will strengthen that process of ADT, and by their own figures, this rule change would only impact 89% of the U.S. cattle and bison herd. They're grouped together there. So what changes are going to impact 11% of the cattle herd, and how does this strengthen disease traceability?
So we're talking about intact breeding stock over 18 months interstate movement. And that's that kind of first chunk they're looking at. That's not any different than what we've seen in previous iterations of this rule, right? That's always been USDA's, going back to the Trump administration, USDA's sort of area they want to begin this process. What we've seen that's different is has historically been a conversation about RFID. Now they're saying EID, and that's sort of a nod towards the fact that technology is evolving. NCBA's policy has and continues to be technology agnostic, meaning we're not picking high frequency versus low frequency or a certain kind of tag. We believe that's the marketplace's job to figure out what's going to work for cattle producers. This rule, though, is one that we're going to have to be really careful with, because the data collection on the front end, I think, is raising some antennas. We're very focused on producer privacy in this space. We have to have a nationally significant traceability program, because if we don't, and we see FMD reach our shores again for the first time in 100 years, it could shut the industry down. And without that documentation and that ability to unlock FMD-free portions of the supply chain, we're going to have a lot of producers that are really hurting. And we want to make sure we're doing whatever we can to avoid that. And so trying to do this in a way that works to allow for that readily accessible information, but also protects producers' privacy, and also isn't being borne by the cattle producer, right? We can't have this be a system that is coming out of the pockets of producers that are already struggling to be profitable with input costs and everything else. So that's where our focus is going to be in working through this rule and trying to make sure that we get something as a finished product that's really workable and protects producers.
And obviously we have a new Congress in session right now. The Republicans have a slim majority there in the House, and then the Senate is still controlled by the Democrats, and it is a Farm Bill year. And a question that I asked Congressman August Pfluger a few weeks ago at the American Sheep Industry Association convention is, will the Farm Bill get passed in 2023 with the two different parties controlling the two different houses? What is the projection on actually getting a Farm Bill passed, and what are some of the key priorities that NCBA is working on behalf of their members?
Well, I'm kind of curious what Congressman Pfluger had to say about it, but it is a difficult year to get that done. We saw in the first week of this new Congress the struggle Kevin McCarthy had to become Speaker, right? What is largely a ceremonial process turned into a week-long battle. That is the same math we're going to be doing on everything that's done this year. And when we're talking about a bill that's going to be north of $1 trillion, a lot of new spending just to keep up with inflation, that's going to really be a tough sell for a lot of these newer members of Congress, particularly the ones that kind of have returned to some of that fiscal conservatism that we've seen in the past after several years of pretty reckless spending in Washington. That's understandable, but that's going to be sort of the looking glass we're going to have to view all of these programs through. That is a big challenge, and you do have some of those members that are saying, I'm not voting for a farm bill no matter what's in it. And that's going to be a hill we're going to have to climb, and educate them about the need for this bill, why it's so important for voluntary conservation programs and risk management funding and the vaccine bank for FMD and all these different tools that we use, but also to make sure that we don't watch this bill turn into something it shouldn't be, right? A climate weapon, or a vehicle for people to get their little niche priorities across the finish line. That's not what this should be either. So it's going to be a long year, but this is an important process. And even if we don't get it passed this year, the foundation of what's put together will kind of roll through the next year or two. We've seen that in the past. It might take a couple years to get it passed, but we'll get there.
Yeah. Well, again, Ethan Lane, the Vice President of Government Affairs in Washington, D.C. for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And again, a lot of producers flying down here to the Big Easy to participate in Cattle Convention 2023 and take in the NCBA trade show.